Deep in the rolling hills of Virginia, where mist clings to the valleys like secrets to guilty minds, stands the Ashcroft Estate. An architectural marvel of its time, the grand manor house rises from the landscape like a monument to wealth and ambition. In 1833, this sprawling plantation was the crown jewel of Fairfield County, its white columns gleaming against the backdrop of ancient oak trees that whispered stories too terrible to be told aloud. Between 1810 and 1833, 17 young women entered the Ashcroft Estate as brides-to-be, their faces bright with promise and hope. Not one completed her wedding vows. Each vanished without a trace on the eve of her wedding, leaving behind nothing but whispers and unanswered questions. The authorities at the time documented these disappearances with clinical detachment, their reports sealed away in county archives for nearly a century. Recently discovered correspondence between the estate's physician and a renowned medical university in Philadelphia reveals a pattern of systematic deception. Leather-bound journals, hidden beneath the floorboards of the estate's east wing, contain observations written in a practiced hand, observations no ethical doctor would ever record. These documents, finally unsealed after decades of institutional silence, paint a picture far more disturbing than the ghost stories locals have passed down through generations. Are you brave enough to learn what really happened at the Ashcroft Estate? The truth isn't found in superstition or the supernatural phenomena so many attributed to the mansion's curse. What occurred behind those stately doors wasn't magic or divine punishment. It was something far more rational and infinitely more dangerous. The Ashcroft Estate was established in 1795 by Colonel William Ashcroft, a Revolutionary War veteran whose tactical brilliance on the battlefield was matched only by his ruthlessness in business. By 1810, his plantation had grown into one of the most prosperous in Virginia, its fields stretching across 3,000 acres of fertile land. The main house stood 3 stories tall, its architecture a blend of Georgian symmetry and neoclassical grandeur that proclaimed the family's status to all who approached. The interior spoke of European sophistication, marble imported from Italy, furniture crafted by the finest artisans in Boston, paintings commissioned from artists whose work hung in presidential mansions. But beneath this veneer of cultured refinement, the house held an unusual feature, an expansive basement level with thick stone walls and oddly positioned drains in the flagstone floors. Colonel Ashcroft attributed this peculiarity to his interest in wine storage and scientific pursuits, an explanation that satisfied the casual visitor. The Ashcrofts were not merely wealthy, they were influential. The colonel's position on the state medical board gave him connections to universities and hospitals across the eastern seaboard. His youngest son, Thaddeus, followed his father's interest in medicine, studying at the University of Pennsylvania before returning to the family estate to establish what he called a progressive research practice in a separate wing of the mansion. Fairfield County in the 1830s was a place of strict social hierarchies and rigid expectations. Women of good breeding were valued primarily as vehicles for alliance and continuation of family lines. Medical science was emerging from centuries of superstition, but this transition created a dangerous middle ground where experimental approaches could be justified in the name of progress while still shrouded in secrecy. The Ashcrofts stood at this intersection of old money, new science, and unquestioned patriarchal authority, a perfect storm of power without accountability. Abel Miller, a tenant farmer whose modest cabin stood at the edge of Ashcroft land, was the first to notice something amiss. A quiet man of 35 who kept to himself, Abel had little reason to approach the main house except on quarterly business. But on a foggy November evening in 1810, while tracking a wounded fox, he found himself nearer to the mansion than he'd ever ventured before. The mist was thick as wool that night, he later told his sister in a letter preserved by her descendants. I heard a woman crying, not like ordinary sadness, but like her heart was being torn from her chest. It came from a small building set apart from the main house, with windows so bright it seemed every lamp in Virginia burned inside. Then the crying stopped sudden-like, cut off in the middle of a breath. The silence after was worse than the screaming. Abel reported what he'd heard to the county sheriff the next morning, only to be reminded sharply that the Ashcroft family's business was their own, and that imagination could play tricks on a simple man in the fog. 3 days later, the community learned that Miss Eleanor Pembroke, engaged to be married to Thaddeus Ashcroft, had taken ill with brain fever and returned to her family in Richmond. No one in Richmond ever reported seeing her arrive. Abel never approached the authorities again, but he began keeping a journal of strange occurrences. He noted carriages arriving after midnight, carrying trunks and crates marked with university insignia. He documented the dates when lamps burned until dawn in the separate wing where Dr. Thaddeus conducted his work. Most disturbingly, he recorded the screams, always women's voices, always cutting off abruptly, always followed by days of unusual activity as wagons came and went, covered with tarpaulins despite clear weather. "The thing I can't forget," he wrote in his final entry, "is the smell. When the wind blows from the east, it carries a scent like the aftermath of butchering day mixed with chemical smells from an apothecary's shop. It clings to your clothes and follows you into your dreams. I've seen 3 brides come to that house now, and not one has left as herself. Something is happening at the Ashcroft Estate that no God-fearing person could countenance." Abel Miller was found dead a week later, apparently from a fall from his horse. His journal disappeared from his cabin the same night. By 1815, the pattern had established itself with a chilling regularity that somehow escaped official notice. Every 18 months or so, Thaddeus Ashcroft would announce his engagement to a young woman from a good family, never local, always from far enough away that direct connections to the community were minimal. The young lady would arrive at the estate, be introduced at a single formal dinner, and then retreat into relative seclusion for the weeks preceding the wedding, seeing only the family physician, Thaddeus himself, and occasionally the colonel. Then, invariably, some crisis would emerge on the eve of the wedding. The bride had fallen ill with a mysterious ailment. The bride had received urgent news requiring her immediate departure. The bride had experienced a nervous collapse and required specialized treatment elsewhere. No wedding took place, and no bride was ever seen in public again. What neighbors and local authorities failed to observe, however, was documented meticulously in the private correspondence between Thaddeus Ashcroft and Dr. Wendell Phillips of the Philadelphia Medical College. Letters recovered in 1920 from a sealed compartment in Phillips' desk reveal a relationship centered not on friendship, but on scientific exchange. Subject 4 demonstrated the same peculiar resistance to the procedure as the previous 3. Thaddeus wrote in 1816, "I have modified the approach according to your suggestions, introducing the preliminary treatments gradually over the 4 weeks prior to the primary intervention. The results show marked improvement in malleability, though retention remains imperfect. I believe with continued refinements, we may achieve the transformation we seek, Doctor." Phillips' replies were clinical and encouraging, offering suggestions for reducing autonomous will and restructuring memory architecture without damaging essential functions. He repeatedly requested specimens and observational data, which Thaddeus provided through detailed drawings and preserved tissue samples sent by private courier. What these men were attempting remained obscured in coded language, but the pattern of their work became clearer with each bride who disappeared. They sought nothing less than the complete reconditioning of the human mind. Specifically, female minds they considered simpler and more adaptable than male counterparts. The brides were not chosen for love or connection, but for specific physiological and psychological traits that made them ideal test subjects. Catherine Winslow arrived at the Ashcroft Estate in early spring of 1820, the 7th bride to cross its threshold. Unlike her predecessors, Catherine came with a sharp intellect honed through years of self-directed study in her father's extensive library. At 23, she was slightly older than the typical Ashcroft bride and considerably more observant. From her first day, Catherine noticed discrepancies in the household's presentation. The servants avoided eye contact and spoke in rehearsed pleasantries. Doors to certain wings remained locked at all times. The colonel, now elderly but still imposing, watched her with calculating eyes that belied his cordial words. And Thaddeus, her husband-to-be, regarded her less as a future wife than as an intriguing specimen. "He measures me with his eyes," she wrote in a journal kept hidden in the lining of her trunk. "Not in the way of men admiring beauty, but as a carpenter might measure wood before cutting. Yesterday he asked me to complete a series of puzzles, timing how quickly I solved each one. When I performed well, he seemed pleased not as a proud fiancé, but as a researcher whose hypothesis has been confirmed. I am increasingly convinced that my presence here has little to do with matrimony." Catherine began her own counter-investigation, rising at night to explore the mansion when others slept. She documented the layout in coded drawings, noting which areas remained inaccessible and which triggered unusual reactions when she expressed interest in them. She collected and preserved unusual substances found in her food, a sedative powder she suspected that she had detected by its slight bitterness and had only pretended to consume. Most importantly, she observed the changes in her own physical condition. The daily tonics Thaddeus prescribed left her with periods of missing time and confused memories. On days when she secretly avoided taking them, her mind remained clear, but she had to carefully mimic the docile compliance they usually induced. "They are attempting to remake me," she wrote in her increasingly frantic entries. I overheard Thaddeus speaking with his father about the conditioning process and preparing the subject. They do not speak of a wedding anymore, but of a procedure scheduled for the night before what should be my wedding day. I found a hidden cabinet in Thaddeus's study containing small bottles of preserved brain tissue, each labeled with a woman's name and date. Elizabeth, June 1810. Margaret, December 1811. Names that match the missing brides, whose fates now seem terribly clear. Catherine's final entry, written in a shaking hand, revealed her discovery of the true horrors awaiting her. Through careful observation and one dangerous nighttime expedition to the restricted wing, she had located Thaddeus's surgical theater, a room deep in the basement level where gleaming instruments were arranged with disturbing precision around an operating table fitted with restraints. I know now what becomes of the Ashcroft brides. Not death, or at least not immediately, but something perhaps worse. Thaddeus believes he has perfected a surgical process to create what he calls the ideal female companion. Compliant, without independent thought or will, a living doll to be programmed with only those traits found desirable in a wife. The previous subjects failed because the procedure left them too diminished to function. But he believes I am the perfect candidate for his refined technique. Tomorrow night, while the house sleeps, they plan to take me to that room. I have found a way out through the servants' passage, but I must time my escape perfectly. If I am caught, I know my fate will be that operating table. Catherine Winslow disappeared from the Ashcroft Estate on the eve of her wedding, not into Thaddeus's surgical theatre, but into the night. Taking advantage of a spring thunderstorm that distracted the household, she fled with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small packet of evidence sewn into the hem of her dress. She traveled nearly 15 miles on foot before reaching the home of Reverend Thomas Hargrove, a Methodist minister known for his outspoken criticism of the elite families who controlled the county. The Reverend found himself facing a rain-soaked young woman with wild eyes and an even wilder tale. What convinced him to listen when so many might have turned her away was the physical evidence she presented. pages torn from Thaddeus's research journal, a vial of the sedative she had been given, and a small gold locket containing a miniature portrait, a portrait of Elizabeth Bennet, the first bride to vanish, whose family had been told she died of typhoid fever after leaving the estate. She spoke with the clarity of truth, Reverend Hargrove later wrote in his private correspondence. Her account was too detailed, too coherent in its horror to be the product of feminine hysteria or imagination. The evidence she brought compelled me to act, despite the considerable risk to my position and perhaps my life. Hargrove contacted authorities outside the Ashcrofts' sphere of influence, reaching out to a magistrate in Richmond with whom he had attended seminary. Within a week, a small party of officials arrived to investigate the estate, armed with documents that even the Colonel's influence couldn't override. When the authorities arrived at the Ashcroft Estate, they found the mansion immaculately maintained, every room open for inspection, and completely emptied of anything incriminating. The surgical theatre Catherine had described had been transformed into a wine cellar, the operating table replaced by oak barrels. Thaddeus's research journals and specimens were nowhere to be found. Even the servants had been replaced with new staff who claimed to have been employed for years, but whom no locals recognized. Colonel Ashcroft and his son received the officials with perfect Virginia hospitality, expressing shock and concern over the delusions of poor Miss Winslow, who had clearly suffered some kind of nervous collapse. They presented documents, medical evaluations, letters, all immaculately forged, suggesting Catherine had a history of mental instability carefully hidden by her family to secure her a prestigious marriage. When the authorities departed, they left with apologies rather than arrests. Reverend Hargrove wrote bitterly, "The power of wealth and connection proved stronger than justice. The Ashcrofts remain untouched, while Miss Winslow is now viewed as a hysterical woman who invented horrible fictions about her benefactors. I fear we have failed her utterly." Despite the official exoneration of the Ashcroft family, the investigation left lasting cracks in their carefully constructed facade. Whispers spread through the county's drawing rooms and servants' quarters alike. People began to notice patterns they had previously overlooked. The succession of brides who never became wives, the strange deliveries that arrived only at night, the increasing seclusion of the once social family. No charges were filed, but something had shifted in the community's perception. Colonel William Ashcroft died in the winter of 1823, his funeral attended by the obligatory dignitaries, but few genuine mourners. Thaddeus inherited the estate in its entirety, along with his father's connections in medical and political circles. Rather than curtailing his activities after the close call with Catherine Winslow, he seemed emboldened by the family's ability to escape consequences. Within 6 months of his father's death, a new engagement was announced. Sarah Fleming was the daughter of a wealthy tobacco merchant from North Carolina. At 19, she possessed the qualities Thaddeus now sought with scientific precision: intelligence without education, beauty without vanity, and most importantly, no close family beyond her elderly father. She arrived at the estate in the summer of 1824, a slender girl with curious eyes that missed nothing. "The house feels wrong," she wrote in letters to her childhood friend Mary. "The servants move like sleepwalkers, their expressions blank even when they smile. My fiancé watches me constantly, but rarely speaks directly to me. He asks strange questions about my memory, my dreams, whether I've ever experienced episodes of lost time. I tell him what I think he wants to hear, but I keep my true thoughts hidden." Unlike Catherine Winslow, Sarah did not have the advantage of advanced education or worldly experience. What she possessed instead was intuition, a finely tuned sense of danger that had kept her safe through a difficult childhood under her father's mercurial moods. This intuition now screamed warnings with every day she spent at the Ashcroft Estate. Sarah began noticing the patterns in her daily routine. The bitter tea served promptly at 9 each morning, after which her thoughts would grow foggy. The weekly examinations Thaddeus conducted, measuring her skull with calipers and testing her reflexes with increasingly invasive methods. The questions that probed for weaknesses, fears, traumas, moments of humiliation that he recorded in a leather-bound journal with unsettling enthusiasm. Most disturbing were the changes she observed in herself. Gaps appeared in her memory, hours that vanished without trace. She would find herself in rooms with no recollection of entering them, or discover bruises on her arms and tiny puncture marks she couldn't explain. Notes appeared in her handwriting that she had no memory of writing, answering questions she had no memory of being asked. "I believe I am being unmade," she confided to Mary in a letter she never had the opportunity to send. "Piece by piece, something of myself is being taken away and replaced with emptiness. Last night, I could not recall the name of my childhood dog for nearly an hour. The day before, I found myself staring at a portrait of my mother, unable to summon any feeling of connection to her face. Whatever Thaddeus is doing to me, it is changing who I am at the foundation of my being." Sarah's suspicions crystallized into certainty when she discovered a hidden compartment in her bedroom, not through clever investigation, but through simple accident. A loose floorboard beneath the Persian rug shifted under her weight one evening, revealing a space that had been used by previous occupants of the room. Inside, she found fragments of evidence left by those who had come before her, a torn piece of lace with "Help Me" embroidered in tiny stitches, a button from a dress she recognized as belonging to Catherine Winslow, whose story had reached even North Carolina. A small diary with entries from at least 3 different hands, all expressing increasing terror as their wedding days approached. The most damning discovery was a folded paper containing what appeared to be a surgical protocol, written in Thaddeus's precise handwriting. It detailed a procedure for accessing specific regions of the brain through the eye socket and nasal cavity, approaches that would leave no visible scars, and methods for excising centers of willful disobedience while preserving functions necessary for companionship and household management. Sarah realized with growing horror that she was not simply being drugged or manipulated. She was being prepared for a fundamental reconstruction of her mind and personality. The wedding was scheduled for September 15th. According to the notes she found, the preparatory procedure would take place the night before, rendering her compliant for the ceremony and receptive to the final adjustments afterward. She had less than 2 weeks to escape. Unlike Catherine, Sarah could not simply flee into the night. After Catherine's escape, Thaddeus had implemented more stringent security measures. The estate was now patrolled by dogs, the servants watched her constantly, the windows were fitted with locks accessible only from the outside. Her correspondence was read before being sent, her movements restricted to approved areas of the house and grounds. Even if she managed to leave the property, she had no allies within 50 miles, no means of transportation, and no resources beyond the clothes she wore. Sarah's solution was as desperate as it was clever. If she could not escape physically, she would escape detection by becoming exactly what Thaddeus wanted, but on her own terms, not his. She began by appearing to succumb to the drugs more quickly and completely than she actually did. For weeks, she had been secretly spitting out portions of her drugged tea when unobserved and studying its effects when she did consume it. Now she feigned greater docility, more pronounced memory loss, increased suggestibility. She answered Thaddeus's questions with the blank compliance he sought, while maintaining a hidden core of awareness. "The key is to give him what he expects to see," she wrote in tiny script on the back of a dress label hidden inside the hem of her nightgown. "He believes women are fundamentally weak-minded and easily manipulated. His arrogance blinds him to the possibility that I might be manipulating him in return. Each day, I become outwardly more the empty vessel he desires, while inwardly I grow stronger and more determined." Sarah's performance convinced Thaddeus that his preparatory treatments were working exceptionally well. He noted in his journal, which she secretly read when he was occupied elsewhere, that Subject 12 demonstrates unprecedented receptivity to cognitive restructuring. Preliminary dissolution of personality structures has occurred more rapidly than in any previous subject, suggesting that the refined formula achieves superior results. The procedure may be conducted earlier than scheduled if this trajectory continues. This was exactly what Sarah had hoped for, and what she feared most. She needed Thaddeus to move up the timetable, but each day brought her closer to the point where his treatments might actually overcome her resistance. The battle between her will and his science grew more precarious with each passing hour. On September 8th, 1 week before the planned wedding, Thaddeus made his move. Pleased with Sarah's apparent transformation, he decided to conduct the primary procedure that night, rather than waiting. Sarah, who had been carefully observing the household patterns, knew something had changed when dinner was served with a different wine than usual, one with a stronger, bitter undertone that signaled a more powerful sedative. She managed to avoid drinking more than a few sips, feigning greater intoxication than she felt. As servants led her to her room, she noted with mounting terror the unusual preparations. The bedroom had been stripped of all but essential furniture, the bed linens replaced with rubberized sheets, medical instruments laid out on a covered tray. This was to be no minor intervention, but the central procedure Thaddeus had been working toward for months. As twilight deepened into night, Sarah implemented the desperate plan she had been developing since discovering the truth. From materials gathered and hidden over weeks, a hairpin, candle wax, threads pulled from her garments, she had fashioned a crude lockpick that would open her bedroom door. The household expected her to be unconscious from the drugged wine. They would not come for her until Thaddeus was ready to begin his work. She waited until the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 11, then slipped from her room like a ghost. Instead of heading for the exits, which she knew would be guarded, she moved deeper into the heart of the mansion, toward Thaddeus's private study. If she could not escape, she would gather evidence so compelling that even the Ashcrofts could not dismiss it, and she would ensure that evidence reached the outside world. The study door yielded to her improvised tools after several tense minutes. Inside, illuminated only by moonlight filtering through the windows, stood the physical manifestation of Thaddeus's madness. Cabinets filled with specimens preserved in alcohol, detailed anatomical drawings of the human brain with specific regions highlighted and annotated, journals documenting years of research conducted on unwilling subjects. Most disturbing were the glass containers on a high shelf, each holding what appeared to be preserved brain tissue, labeled with women's names and dates. 17 in total, though Sarah had only accounted for 12 missing brides. He had been practicing long before he began targeting brides, she later testified. The earliest specimens dated back to his university days. Indigent women, slaves, anyone who wouldn't be missed or searched for too diligently. The brides came later, when he needed subjects of specific backgrounds and temperaments to refine his techniques. Sarah worked quickly, gathering the most incriminating documents and securing them inside her clothing. She located a small service door mentioned in Catherine Winslow's hidden diary, an exit that had been sealed after Catherine's escape, but that might still offer a path if she could open it. As she turned to leave, however, the study door swung open to reveal Thaddeus, his face a mask of scientific curiosity rather than anger. "Fascinating," he said softly, observing her with clinical detachment. "The preparatory treatments should have rendered you completely suggestible by now. Your resistance suggests anomalies in your neurological structure that warrant further investigation." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. This development, while unexpected, may ultimately advance our understanding. Now, return to your room for tonight's procedure. What happened next was reconstructed later from physical evidence and Sarah's own account. Rather than complying, she backed away, putting the massive desk between them. Thaddeus continued his approach, his voice maintaining its eerily calm tone as he detailed the contributions her unusual brain would make to his research. As he reached for her, Sarah grabbed the nearest object, a heavy brass microscope, and brought it down on his head with all the strength fear and desperation could provide. Thaddeus crumpled to the floor, blood seeping from a gash on his temple. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, the microscope still clutched in her trembling hands, certain she had killed him. Then she saw his chest rise with shallow breath. He was unconscious but alive, which meant her time was severely limited. She abandoned subtlety for speed, forcing open the sealed service door with a letter opener from the desk. The passage beyond was dark and thick with cobwebs, but it offered a path to the outside that bypassed the main halls where servants might be encountered. Sarah pushed through the darkness, emerging finally into the kitchen gardens at the rear of the estate. The night air carried the first chill of approaching autumn as she ran across the moonlit grounds, expecting at any moment to hear shouts of alarm or the baying of dogs. None came. The household remained quiet, unaware that their master lay bleeding in his study, and his latest subject was fleeing into the Virginia countryside. Sarah traveled through the night, keeping to fields and woodland paths rather than roads where she might be spotted. By dawn she had covered nearly 10 miles, her dress torn, her feet blistered and bleeding in her delicate house slippers. She reached the town of Millfield as church bells rang for morning service, her appearance causing immediate consternation among the churchgoers gathering on the steps. Among them was Judge William Harrison, visiting from Richmond to handle a land dispute case. Unlike the local magistrates, Judge Harrison had no ties to the Ashcroft family, and no reason to dismiss the wild-eyed young woman clutching a bundle of papers and begging for protection. When she collapsed from exhaustion on the church steps, he brought her to the safety of the pastor's residence and summoned a physician to attend to her. "I have seen much in my 30 years on the bench," Judge Harrison wrote afterward, "but nothing prepared me for the documents this brave young woman presented." The clinical detachment with which Ashcroft documented his atrocities was perhaps more chilling than the acts themselves. Here was a man who had convinced himself that the systematic destruction of human minds was justified in the name of scientific progress and male authority. The specimens she described, the surgical notes, the detailed observations of his victim's deterioration, all pointed to a monstrous enterprise conducted over many years under the guise of medical research. Judge Harrison dispatched riders to the county sheriff and to the governor's office in Richmond. By midday, a party of armed men was on its way to the Ashcroft Estate, with orders to secure the premises and arrest Thaddeus Ashcroft for crimes against multiple victims. Sarah, despite her exhaustion, insisted on accompanying them to ensure nothing was overlooked or explained away. When they arrived at the estate gates, however, they found them standing open. The house beyond sat silent and still in the afternoon sun, smoke rising from only one chimney despite the autumn chill. No servants came to meet them, no dogs barked at their approach. The grand entrance door swung open at a touch, revealing an interior in perfect order but devoid of human presence. The authorities moved through the mansion with growing unease, each empty room increasing their sense that something was profoundly wrong. The kitchen stood abandoned mid-preparation, bread dough left to rise, vegetables half chopped on cutting boards. Bedrooms remained made up with personal items still in place, as if the occupants had stepped out momentarily rather than fled. Only when they reached Thaddeus's study did they find evidence of disturbance. A blood stain on the carpet, partially cleaned, the desk disordered, a cabinet of specimens standing open and conspicuously empty. "He's removed the evidence," Sarah said, her voice hollow with dismay. "He's taken everything that would corroborate my account." Judge Harrison placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Not everything, Miss Fleming. You were wise enough to take the most damning documents with you. And there is still the basement laboratory you described. The entrance to the basement level was concealed behind paneling in what appeared to be a linen closet, a hiding place Sarah knew of only through Catherine Winslow's diary. The panel slid aside to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. As they made their way down, lanterns held high, the sweet, sour smell of chemical preservatives and something less identifiable grew stronger. What they found in the chambers below the mansion would haunt those present for the remainder of their lives. The main room had indeed been converted to resemble a wine cellar, with barrels and bottles arranged in meticulous rows. But beyond this facade lay rooms that confirmed the darkest aspects of Sarah's testimony. The surgical theater remained intact, apparently too difficult to dismantle and relocate quickly. The operating table with its restraints stood in the center of a circular room, surrounded by instruments designed for delicate work on the human brain. Drains in the floor led to a complex system for disposing of fluids and waste. Most disturbing were the detailed diagrams covering one wall, human heads in profile and cross-section, with specific regions of the brain color-coded and annotated in Thaddeus's precise handwriting. Seat of personal will, read one label. Center of moral objection, noted another. Memory consolidation, target for selective erasure, indicated a third. The clinical precision made the horror all the more profound. Adjacent chambers revealed the true extent of Thaddeus's operation. One room contained 6 narrow beds, each occupied by a female figure lying motionless under white sheets. Initial hope that these might be living victims faded quickly as examination revealed the truth. Each was deceased, their bodies preserved through some experimental process that left the skin with a waxy appearance and an unnatural, cool firmness to the touch. These women have been dead for some time, the physician accompanying the party stated after examination. Months, perhaps years, yet decay has been artificially arrested. I cannot determine the cause of death without more thorough examination, but each shows evidence of surgical intervention in the cranial region. The most terrible discovery lay in what appeared to be a recovery room, where 3 women sat in rocking chairs, facing a window that looked out on a painted pastoral scene rather than the actual basement wall. Unlike the preserved bodies, these women lived. They breathed, their hearts beat, their eyes blinked, but they showed no reaction to the entrance of the search party. They continued rocking at precisely the same tempo, their vacant gazes fixed on the artificial window, their expressions serene and empty. Margaret? Judge Harrison approached one woman whose face matched a miniature portrait found among Thaddeus's papers. Margaret Thornfield? No response came, not even a flicker of recognition. The woman continued her mechanical rocking, a placid smile fixed on her lips. The physician examined each woman carefully, his expression growing grimmer with each assessment. "They've been surgically altered," he finally announced. "There are healed incisions at the temples and behind the ears hidden by their hair. Without a more invasive examination, I cannot determine exactly what was done, but they appear to have been hollowed out. They respond to basic physical stimuli, but show no higher awareness, no self-directed behavior." "The successes," Sarah whispered, recalling phrases from Thaddeus's notes. "The ones whose procedures achieved his definition of perfection. Complete compliance, absence of independent will, preservation of basic functions." Her voice broke. "This is what he intended for me, for all of us." 7 women were recovered from the Ashcroft Estate that day. 3 living, but irreparably damaged. 4 deceased, but preserved. All matched the descriptions of young women who had disappeared after arriving as prospective Ashcroft brides. The remaining 10 victims documented in Thaddeus's research journals were never found. Of Thaddeus himself, there was no trace. Blood evidence in his study confirmed Sarah's account of their confrontation, but it appeared he had regained consciousness and organized a rapid evacuation of the estate. Financial records later revealed massive withdrawals from Ashcroft accounts in the days immediately following Sarah's escape, suggesting a planned flight rather than a panicked reaction. The story of the Ashcroft Estate exploded across Virginia like wildfire, soon spreading to newspapers throughout the eastern seaboard. Initial skepticism gave way to horror as physical evidence and Sarah's testimony, articulate, detailed, and unwavering despite the trauma she had endured, painted an undeniable picture of methodical atrocity conducted over decades. "The most disturbing aspect," wrote the editor of the Richmond Enquirer, "is not the madness of one man, but the system that enabled him. How many saw signs but looked away? How many chose the comfort of ignorance over the obligation to question? The Ashcroft case indicts not just a murderer, but a society that grants certain men such power that they believe themselves above not just law, but basic humanity." The surviving victims presented authorities with an unprecedented ethical challenge. The three women recovered alive from the basement, identified as Margaret Thornfield, Eliza Woodward, and Rebecca Palmer, existed in a state medical science had no framework to understand or treat. They required constant care, unable to communicate or perform even basic self-maintenance. They showed no recognition of their own families, no memory of their former lives, no awareness of their circumstances. "They are not insane in any traditional sense," wrote Dr. James Halloway, who supervised their care at the newly established Fairfield Sanitarium. "Insanity implies disordered thought, but these women appear to have been stripped of the capacity for thought itself. They exist in a perpetual present moment, responding to immediate stimuli, but forming no memories, expressing no preferences, initiating no actions. Thaddeus Ashcroft did not merely damage their minds. He systematically excised those qualities that made them human individuals." The families of the victims responded with varied emotions: grief, horror, guilt for having entrusted their daughters to the Ashcroft household. Some refused to acknowledge their connection to the empty women, as they came to be called, finding the reality too painful to face. Others dedicated themselves to their care, clinging to the hope that some spark of their loved ones might still exist beneath the surgical damage. Margaret Thornfield's younger sister Emily became a particularly vocal advocate, establishing a foundation to support the victims and their families. "What my sister endured must not be forgotten or sanitized," she declared in an address to the Virginia legislature. Her fate reveals the darkest consequence of viewing women as property to be shaped according to male desire. Margaret was not valued for her mind, her spirit, or her humanity, only for her potential to be molded into a proper wife. Thaddeus Ashcroft merely took this common attitude to its most extreme conclusion. The search for Thaddeus continued for years, extending eventually to Europe and beyond. Reported sightings placed him in Paris, Vienna, Istanbul, always in centers of medical research and innovation, always moving on before authorities could confirm his presence. The most credible evidence suggested he had established a new identity as a specialist in neurological disorders at a private clinic in Switzerland. But by the time investigators arrived, the doctor matching his description had relocated without leaving a forwarding address. In 1845, 12 years after the Ashcroft Estate was exposed, a journal of experimental neurology published by a medical society in Berlin included a paper on surgical approaches to behavioral modification authored by a Dr. Theodore Ascher. The detailed protocols described in the paper bore striking similarities to those found in Thaddeus's notes, though with more sophisticated techniques reflecting years of continued experimentation. By the time American authorities requested information from their German counterparts, the journal's publishers claimed to have no record of Dr. Ascher's actual identity or location. The legacy of the Ashcroft case extended far beyond the fate of its immediate victims. The public exposure of such methodical cruelty conducted under the guise of scientific progress sparked intense debates about medical ethics, women's autonomy, and the oversight of experimental procedures. The Virginia Medical Society established the first formal ethics committee in American medicine, specifically in response to the Ashcroft revelations, requiring peer review of research protocols and explicitly prohibiting experimentation without informed consent. The Ashcroft Estate itself stood abandoned after the investigation, its reputation too tainted for any buyer to consider. Nature gradually reclaimed the once manicured grounds. Vines crept up the white columns, windows shattered in winter storms and were not replaced. Local children dared each other to approach the house at night, claiming they could hear the rocking chairs still moving in the basement, the empty women still gazing at painted scenery that had long since faded away. In 1858, a fire of unknown origin consumed the mansion. Witnesses reported that the flames took on unusual colors, greens and blues attributed to the chemicals still stored in the basement laboratories. By morning, nothing remained but the stone foundation and blackened chimneys rising from the ashes like accusing fingers. As for Sarah Fleming, her escape and testimony made her both celebrated and isolated. While publicly hailed as heroic, she found herself treated as an object of morbid curiosity, defined forever by her connection to the Ashcroft horrors. Unable to resume a normal life in American society, she eventually relocated to England, where she lived under an assumed name and worked as a governess for a progressive family that valued her intelligence and resilience without knowing her history. Only in her final years, as she felt mortality approaching, did Sarah break her silence. In 1883, 50 years after the Ashcroft case, she published a memoir under her true name, The Architecture of Evil: My Escape from the Ashcroft Estate. The book provided the most complete first-hand account of Thaddeus's methods and motivations, drawing not only on her personal experience, but on the documents she had taken from his study, documents she had kept hidden for decades, fearing they might fall into the wrong hands. "The most important understanding I gained from my ordeal," she wrote in the memoir's conclusion, "is that evil rarely recognizes itself as such. Thaddeus Ashcroft genuinely believed his work served a greater purpose, the advancement of scientific knowledge and the perfection of what he considered the natural order. He saw himself not as a monster, but as a visionary, working toward an ideal that justified any suffering inflicted along the way. This is perhaps the most dangerous form of evil, not the outright embrace of cruelty for its own sake, but the cold certainty that the end justifies any means, that some lives may be sacrificed in service to an abstract ideal." Sarah Fleming died peacefully in her sleep 3 months after her memoir was published. She was buried in a small churchyard in Cornwall, far from Virginia, and the horrors she had survived. Her gravestone bore only her name and the dates of her life, with a single line of epitaph: "She kept herself when others would have taken it." The 3 surviving victims lived out their days at Fairfield Sanitarium, never recovering any semblance of their former selves. Margaret Thornfield was the last to die in 1891, having spent 58 years in her rocking chair, gazing at nothing, responding to no one. A living testament to the consequences when science abandons conscience. Thaddeus Ashcroft was never captured or brought to justice in any conventional sense. The last credible sighting placed him in Alexandria, Egypt, in 1862, an elderly but still active man examining archaeological finds, with particular interest in ancient Egyptian cranial modification practices. After that, the trail went cold. Whether he died of natural causes, continued his work under deeper cover, or met some other fate remains one of history's unanswered questions. The case of the Ashcroft Estate has been largely forgotten in mainstream historical accounts. Too disturbing to fit neatly into narratives of American progress and too challenging to the sensibilities of subsequent generations. Yet its echoes remain in medical ethics protocols, in evolving understandings of autonomy and consent, and in the ghost stories still told in certain parts of Virginia about brides who vanish and women who rock eternally in chairs underground, their selfhood surgically excised in the name of creating the perfect wife. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the victims comes not from any official record, but from a poem written by Emily Thornfield on the 20th anniversary of her sister's discovery at the estate. They sought to hollow out your mind and fill the space with their design. They thought yourself a simple thing that could be cut with surgeon's steel. But selfhood is not flesh alone. It lives in memory, choice, and will, in loves and hopes and fears and dreams, in all that makes us more than shell. Though they may take the mind apart, the crime reveals the criminal's heart. When science turns from light to shade, progress becomes a new darkness made.